We've all seen the Eiffel Tower, queued at the Louvre, and picnicked on the steps of
Hello,
Sacré-Cœur.
and welcome to Navigating the French, the
treasure hunt
podcast
through
where
the
each
Marais,
episode we look at a French
drag queen
word and
bingo
try
in
and see what
Belleville,
it tells us
graffiti
about French
art
culture.
installations in
I'm your
abandoned
host,
warehouses
Emily
in the
Monaco.
14th.
Today, I'm chatting
Those
with
are the
Lindsey
unique Parisian
Tramuta, a journalist and
experiences we don't
author
want to
of
let
The New
slip
Paris
away.
and more
My
recently,
name is Jennifer
The New
Garrett,
Parisienne.
and I'm the host
She's
of
here
Don't
to
Miss
discuss
This.
a word denoting
From art
an essential
installations
French
to
value
authors'
and
talks
one
to
that
tours
directly
to culinary
opposes the
ateliers
idea
and
that
everything in
France
between.
is a Catholic country.
Each week, Don't Miss
Laïcité.
This will fill you in on the best of what's going on in
Hey,
Paris.
Lindsey, thanks so much
Don't
for
Miss
joining me
This
today.
airs every Sunday on
Thanks
Paris
for having
Underground
me.
Radio.
Sure.
If you think you've got
Can you
something
tell
we
me
should
a
know
little bit about your
please
background
email
and what
us
brought
at
you here to
hello
France?
at
Yeah, so I
parisundergroundradio.com.
came 15
Happy
years
exploring.
ago as a French literature student, and I was in a great program at Temple University in Philadelphia, and had my head in the books of Baudelaire and Georges Sand, and then Afro-Caribbean writers as well, and wanted to really go further with that and take all of that knowledge and transfer it to what it would be like to speak French and to understand French and to dialogue on these topics, but in France. So I came for a summer, and then I came back for my last semester of undergrad, and then I never left. So, I've been very much immersed in everything that involves French culture. Obviously, living here for 15 years and now being able to vote and working as a journalist means that I'm particularly interested in topics that go well beyond anything literary, which is sort of where my journey began. But I'm far removed from that at this point.
Amazing. And you've explored a lot of those concepts in your 2 books now that you have out. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yes. So the first is called The New Paris, and that came out in 2017 and looked at sort of changes in the city, what was behind, from a societal perspective and an economic perspective, what was driving a lot of the change we were seeing, both in terms of urban development and food and entrepreneurialism, and that really was a way to distance myself and also from sort of existing tired narratives about Paris as a museum city that's really just there for a tourist's appreciation, kind of a fantastical playground of destinations. And it's so much more than that, as you know. And so I wanted to distance my work from any sort of stereotype and also offer a different side to the story. And so the second book, The New Parisienne, which came out last summer and more recently in French, continues that sort of mission, but looking at it through its people and specifically through its women, and the same sort of stereotyping and reductive storytelling exists around the women. And so that book looks to combat a lot of that by speaking with and putting forward more than 40 women who are making change in their own way in the capital and who don't look like some sort of codified archetype that sells a lot of product for big companies. She's a real woman with various religious beliefs and political beliefs and sexual orientations and origins and professional trajectories. So really trying to show that this is a real place that should be treated as such.
And I think one of those vestiges of kind of this France that seems anchored in our mindsets as Americans or as anyone looking at France from abroad is this idea that France is a Catholic country. We kind of paint it into this corner of being a Catholic country. And as we both know, not only is that not true from a modern standpoint, we have a huge amount of religious diversity in France, but actually it's not true from a historical standpoint either. I mean, it's very complicated, and I think that's what we're going to get into today, because we're here to talk about this word, laïcité. So it's very complex, but for just a basic dictionary translation, the one that I most often see is secularism. Do you think that that's an adequate translation, or do you think that there's more to the French concept of laïcité than to just use this English word secularism to describe it?
No, secularism is very limited. However, it's often used to try to explain to readers, especially, so in newspapers and magazines, what the closest equivalent in English would be, but it really goes beyond that. And I think you have to consider why the word was created in the first place and how it goes beyond just the separation of church and state. I think you could consider it their version of state secularism, but there really is more going on. And, it really refers to the role of the state in protecting individuals from the claims of religion. So it's not about just necessarily, it began as, if you look back to the French Revolution, it was about trying to keep the Catholic Church out of the affairs of the state, but it was also about guaranteeing individual religious liberty. So, the idea being that in order to promote a sort of freedom of individual conscience, the state must maintain a position of absolute neutrality. And that's so that citizens can practice and maintain their beliefs or not. It's up to them. And that really has evolved, obviously, to, once it was written into law in 1905, it was really meant also to keep public workers, so anyone attached to the state. So whether that's, school teachers, transportation agents, nurses in public hospitals, town hall officials, all of them are supposed to refrain from basically wearing anything that communicates overt religious affiliation. And so really that was meant to protect people. But of course, what happens over time is that it's been sort of, depending on who you ask, it's been sort of abused or stretched, and really come to look to be a lay principle that really targets certain religions more than others. And I imagine we're going to get into that, but essentially, it's not just about separation of church and state. And if you think about the way the American principle operates, we still say the Pledge of Allegiance in schools, and God is in there. So I think it's a much stricter desire to leave people free to believe as they choose, and that the state is supposed to remain neutral. Does it in practice today? Not really.
Right. You have this great point of the Pledge of Allegiance. Another one that I can think of right off the bat is that it would be unheard of, I think, in France, and correct me if I'm wrong, to hear the French president say something like, "God bless France."
Yeah, no, that absolutely doesn't happen. It's all about the republic, and so the state will say things like "Vive la République," "Vive les Français." That's a sort of a unifying way of addressing the nation without having to bring any sort of religious affiliation into it. And so when you think about how originally it was specifically targeted due to the Catholicism, the Catholic foundation in the country. That's not to say that those, that Catholic foundation isn't used to French advantage when they like. Look at all the holidays we still have off that have Catholic undertones and respect Catholic traditions. Do we have Jewish holidays off from work and school? No. Do the Muslims have off for, the entire month of Ramadan? No. So France likes to, and I think this is, simply because of there are some areas where they're willing to see sort of the hypocrisy or the paradox in their thinking, and in other ways they're just very resistant to upending any of these tried and true traditions. So as much as it wants to keep religion out of things, it also kind of plays into it, at least when it comes to Catholicism.
Right. And the Catholicism of France, it's got such a long history. The very first French king who converted was Clovis in 496. His wife has been sainted for basically making France Catholic. And then we start to see, as you mentioned, during the French Revolution, we see the deconsecration of a lot of churches. You see people taking Mary statues out of churches and replacing them with Lady Liberty. So again, we have this idea of the Republic standing above everything else. So already in 1789, you have this idea of people being able to separate their religion from the rest of their life, from their life in the Republic. And in France, public education has been secular since 1882. But as you said, it's so much more complex. We still have Sundays off in France, not Fridays, not Saturdays, but Sundays is sort of this day of rest. And it's not necessarily a day when people are going to go to church, but it is kind of this vestige of our historic Catholicism here.
Well, and what's funny is how much certain businesses and shops have had to fight to get the right to open on Sundays, and for a long time it was really just the Marais, right? So it was a highly in Paris, in any case, it was high tourist foot traffic. Also, there are a lot of Jewish merchants in the Marais historically, and so they would be closed for Shabbat and then could reopen on Sunday. And then that was extended, obviously the Champs-Élysées being almost entirely dedicated to visitors. All of those businesses are allowed to stay open and stay open late. But, that's been a real evolution. So there's a lot that doesn't quite make sense. And what I liked about what you said also about the statues and the statues of liberty and Marianne is almost that the French have replaced any sort of overt devotion to Catholicism with a devotion to the Republic, which could be interpreted as its own form of religion, but that's a whole other topic.
We'll be right back with Navigating the French after a word from our sponsors.
We've all seen the Eiffel Tower, queued at the Louvre, and picnicked on the steps of Sacré-Cœur. But a treasure hunt through the Marais, drag queen bingo in Belleville, graffiti art installations in abandoned warehouses in the 14th? Those are the unique Parisian experiences we don't want to let slip away. My name is Jennifer Garrity, and I'm the host of Don't Miss This. From art installations to authors' talks to tours to culinary ateliers and everything in between. Each week, Don't Miss This will fill you in on the best of what's going on in Paris. Don't Miss This airs every Sunday on Paris Underground Radio. If you think you've got something we should know about, please email us at hello@parisundergroundradio.com. Happy exploring!
Hey, I'm Emily.
And I'm Caroline.
And we live in France, where pretty much every meal demands both a cheese course and a wine pairing.
Amen.
It doesn't need to be a special occasion for you to add this French flair to your daily meals, and we want to help you with that.
That's the thing. A great cheese and a delicious glass of wine can really elevate your at-home dining. However, even if it's a Tuesday night and you're by yourself.
Tuesday night by yourself is the perfect time.
Absolutely.
So get involved. Send us your favorite home meals. Describe the recipe. Let us know what it's all about. And we will put our palates and minds to the test. I'm going to pair it with the most complimentary cheese.
And I am going to figure out a perfect wine pairing.
Tune in on Fridays to hear some of our favorite pairings and to discover some brand new recipes that you can try at home.
Join our guests as we explore how to elevate your home-cooked food.
Can't wait to share these with you. Bon appetit! And now, back to Navigating the French. And there's so much symbolism from Catholicism that gets borrowed over into the Republic. One of the things that was so interesting to witness as someone who comes from the United States, who's been living in France for a very long time, was in 2019, when we had the fire in Notre Dame, and President Macron had to communicate on this fire. And it was really interesting to see the way in which he had to frame this, because during the French Revolution, so many of the churches in France were deconsecrated, and Notre Dame is no longer the property of the Vatican. It's the property of the French state. And yet you wouldn't have seen the same sort of communication if, for example, the Grande Mosquée which is only a 10-minute walk from Notre Dame, if that had caught fire, it wouldn't have been the same kind of mindset. How did you kind of interpret that when you saw Macron communicating on the fire?
Well, I felt very, very quickly disappointed to see, obviously Notre Dame is an incredibly important monument, and clearly it touches people all over the world for a variety of reasons, no matter their religious affiliation. So from a historical perspective, there's a lot of reverence and attachment to this structure and its history. However, to see the level to which wealthy, and not just wealthy, but billionaires, were willing to fight amongst themselves over who could donate more money to rebuilding, and just sort of the rush to support this structure and to save it. And yet the same urgency and the same funding is not given to poverty or the number of migrants that are struggling on the outskirts of Paris or any number of other equally pressing struggles. And that's what I think is to me was very problematic, is the extent to which, this felt like the communication from the government, but not even just the government, from the media, from individuals who were expressing their outright horror at the fact of almost losing this cathedral, struck me as being, kind of unfortunate to a degree, because there's so many people and groups and movements that need the same level of support in this country and that are simply not getting it. And yet this structure was able to summon so much energy and so much emotion from the entire world. And you're sort of wondering, where is all of that energy and emotion when it comes to the people who are discriminated against or marginalized in this country every single day?
Yeah, and despite the fact that France is so nominally devoted to equality, we obviously do see a lot of marginalization here in France. And that can go across gender expression to race. But because we're talking about laïcité today, I know that there is quite a bit of marginalization when it comes to religion. It wants to be invisible, and it's not, because of this idea of laïcité. So I think specifically, we have several communities where this is a concern. I think if you go back in history, you have obviously this very fraught relationship with Jewish communities, and then particularly linked with the Shoah, the deportation of 75,000 Jews during the Vel d'Hiver deportations, and this fact that it was the Vichy regime, which was French and in charge, despite collaborating with the Nazis, it was still the French government that was nominally in charge. And it wasn't until 1995 that Jacques Chirac officially apologized for France's role in this. So you almost have this effacing of this really fraught history.
Well, there's that, and there's also then the discrepancy between sort of the way the government might treat the Hasidic community here and those who wear overt signs of religious affiliation, and then the Muslim community. And that's where there's been a lot of tension. Simply to get to this point I wanted to make, I think we need to get to sort of the other group, which is why laïcité has been such a prominent discussion basically since the 60s. And that's because, there was large scale migration from North Africa after decolonization. And so you had this wave of new generations of French-born Muslims. And that really started to change some of the laws and the updates to the bills on laïcité. So even as 1989, which you would call sort of the first affaire du voile, or all of the issues around headscarves. And that's when the disputes really began on whether Muslim girls should be allowed to wear them in state schools. And this has been hotly contested well beyond 1989. And that debate that went on for seemingly decades led to a law in 2004 prohibiting conspicuous signs of religious affiliation in schools. So that doesn't just pertain to headscarves, but also large crosses and kippas and turbans. But then it went on sort of to be evolved even further in 2011, when you had the ban on burqas and niqabs in public places. And France really was the first European nation to make that prohibition official. In 2010, also, just to add, they banned face coverings in public spaces. So the thing is that with every ebb and flow of the conversation around the headscarf, and we've just had it again somewhat recently, it honestly is constant, the Muslim community feels inordinately targeted by these updates to the law because, at least publicly, the government is not speaking specifically to the Jewish community and what they might wear, especially in the Hasidic community. They're not really speaking to any other religious members of the French community that might exist. You don't really see sort of giant crosses that need to be, at least I haven't come across anything that was quite as overt as, let's say a kippah or a headscarf. But all of that to say is it does feel, especially to the Muslim individuals I've spoken to, and certainly the way they communicate their frustration to the press, is that there are different tolerances made for certain groups. And I'm not saying that that's right, obviously, and I'm not saying that as someone who is Jewish, I obviously am very sensitive to France's role in what happened during the Shoah. So, that's not even up for debate, but you can understand how a group of individuals, particularly after the migratory period, the cite, which are sort of the equivalent of ghettos and detached and removed from culture and access to shops and doctors and pharmacies. And this has been going on since the 60s. And so the Muslims in that group, who already felt relegated to sort of the margins of society and have never been treated as though they're, especially those who are born in France, that they've been treated as though they are equal in the eyes of the Republic, even though by law they are. This sort of targeting of religious symbols seems to them to be another sort of attack on their way of life.
Yeah. In addition to this legislation that you cited, this national legislation banning burqas, banning niqabs, and then making it illegal to wear outward signs of religion, public places, which includes public schools, which includes if you work at the post office, things like this. It is true that it's very easy if you're wearing a crucifix to slip it under the front of your shirt. And then you have women who want to wear a headscarf or who want to wear a skirt that goes below their knees. I remember one, I think it was a Hasidic Jewish schoolgirl who wanted to wear a modest skirt to school. And they said, no, that's an outward sign of religion. And so you have these debates legislating what women can wear or can't wear.
Right. And so where the discussion around laïcité starts to get very murky is when you consider who are typically the individuals who are likely to wear symbols more than others. So it seems to impact women more so than men. And it's another attack on women's bodies. I mean, that's the other interpretation of this, is that obviously religious symbols are not the only way that the state tries to control women's bodies. I mean, we could have a discussion about PMA, which is medically assisted procreation, which is still a struggle here. It's not law that women can use IVF if they're single or in a lesbian couple. So there are other ways that the state is upholding this level of control. But obviously you could say that the long, modest skirt falls under that jurisdiction for them. And I think the other thing to keep in mind, and when I wrote my book, I was doing a lot of research and reading about interpretations on these issues, and not just on laïcité, but sort of the French obsession with the headscarf and Islam in general. And Joan Wallach Scott, who's sort of like the woman to read, I think, at least one of her works, which is called The Politics of the Veil, sort of outlines what's really going on. And it's that, at least on the surface, you think that this is all about keeping the religion out of the affairs of the state, but also when it comes to Islam, that it's about the perception of the veil as being an emblem of radical Islamic politics or a sign of oppression, which of course white feminists love to jump on as well and say, we need to save these women. This is sort of a martyr complex. It's like we need to save these women because wearing the headscarf in France couldn't possibly be their choice, which is obviously untrue. But really, Joan Wallach Scott says that the ban on the veil is really about the desire to eliminate rather than address the growing challenge to French republicanism posed by the aftermath of its colonial history. And if you think about the other debates, the ancillary debates that we keep having in France, racism, discrimination, the fact that we don't, there were no ethnic statistics taken, mostly as a result of Nazi Germany and what that summons in terms of feelings. But that reality is that anything that is seen as a threat to republicanism, which is basically what France is now founded on, gets this sort of treatment. And of course, the belief in Islamic traditions is at least looked at today as sort of the biggest challenge to that quest of republicanism. But that doesn't mean that it's always been. At one time, it really was the Jewish belief. And if you look back around wartime, but even earlier at the turn of the century, the way Jews were treated and perceived in society, even those born in France, also, you could argue, was that treatment was as a result of the French Catholic elite seeing that as a threat to republicanism.
We'll be right back with Navigating the French after a word from our sponsors.
Is Paris the most romantic city in the world? It is, but there's much more to its romantic allure than the Eiffel Tower. The Romancing in Paris podcast aims to reveal the true romantic essence of the city, secret gardens, hidden historic sites, and terribly seductive bars. Join romantic expert and writer Lily Heisey as we discover the city's best romantic spots, ideal for both curious couples and lovers of Paris alike. Ready to experience the real romantic Paris? Tune into the Romancing in Paris podcast every Wednesday on Paris Underground Radio. Visit parisundergroundradio.com/romancing in Paris to listen and subscribe.
What's the recipe for a successful cooking podcast? Hire some experienced hosts.
I'm Omid Tavalai.
And I'm Alana McPherson Tavalai.
We're otherwise known as Emperor Norton. We've been doing this for years. Neither of us has lost any appendages.
You're not building coffins.
Don't make sweeping generalizations or engage in stereotypes.
Because that's what romantic couples do here in the City of Light and love and romance. Vous faites des burgers et des brownies.
Skip the off-holiday humor.
It's not like child exploitation or something.
Do engage in woman-splaining.
Actually, a lot of recipes use both baking powder and baking soda.
Sprinkle liberally with dad jokes.
I don't know what kind of baking powder I'm buying.
It's all single acting. Just so you know.
Just like the men here. They're single acting.
Help me.
And maybe actually a useful recipe once in a while. Tune in to The Transplant Kitchen, a podcast by two Californian chefs in France with a global mindset for cooking, on Paris Underground Radio.
And now, back to navigating the French. You mentioned something really essential that I want to make sure that we circle back to, which is that France, because of this principle of laïcité and because of what happened during World War II, today officially does not take any race or religion statistics of its populace. When we complete a census in France, we don't tick a box on what race we feel we belong to or what religion we believe in. It's completely separate. It's impossible for France to communicate statistics of how many Jewish people we have or how many Muslim people we have because we don't take those statistics. Is that right?
Yeah, essentially. I mean, I think, certain research organizations are able to do some sort of statistic analysis, but, as you say, in terms of a census, there's none of that taken, nor about ethnicity. So you can never really drill down to know for sure what percent of the population are from the Maghreb or from Asia or from elsewhere. And really, I'm not saying it's not a noble ideal to say that we are united under the Republic and we do not want to differentiate between people. But unfortunately, that is not what's happening in practice. And that's what we need. That's what the French really need to be addressing is that, okay, we have these values, we want to uphold them, but we see that there are clear fissures in the way that this is being executed. People are discriminated against. And just this morning, I was looking at an archival video from the 70s interviewing French-born Muslims or just Arabs in general in, I want to say it was sort of an underprivileged, impoverished suburb that was even more disconnected from public works, art and culture, commerce. And the kids, I mean, they were all sort of young kids, I mean, maybe under 20, who were saying like, yeah, we're treated as, that we're not allowed to be in the rest of society, but aren't we French? We were born here. I mean, so this is not a new discussion. And yet today, anytime you start pointing fingers at the French for not addressing their colonial history, for not addressing the discrimination that we know exists because, they sort of hide under the guise or hide behind the guise of universalism. Now there are threats that, this discussion is being imported from American identity politics. And it's like, no, you really haven't addressed what's been going on here for your entire history, essentially. So there's this, it's such a sore topic and it blends so many other issues, right? So laïcité isn't just about religion in the end, it ends up sort of blurring into other topics of discrimination. And so it's really hard to dissociate the two. But when I spoke to women for my book, like Delphine Orveilleur, the rabbi, and Sarah Zouak, who is the co-founder of the organization Lalab, which supports Muslim women and gives them a voice and tools and resources to sort of live out their lives, both of them agree that, laïcité really is a noble value and it really does have merit existing, but there are abuses. And until the government and or the state really acknowledges those abuses, we're going to keep doing this song and dance where we point fingers at specific groups and make them feel even more other than they already are.
Yeah, I think it's really easy to compare France and America, and sometimes it's appropriate and sometimes it's not. But in reality, I mean, we had our revolutions at around the same time based on a lot of the same philosophies and documents and thought processes. And I know that both America and France were founded on these joint principles of liberty and equality. But when you look at the way in which they were interpreted in the States, we tended to put liberty first. And in France, they tended to put equality first. And I'm not talking equity. I'm talking almost this like leveling of society. It's like, we're not going to look at the differences. We're going to pretend they don't exist. And that way everyone will have the same thing.
Yeah, except that doesn't take into account, migration that happened much later and what happens when the people who are arriving into the country have other beliefs. Then what do you do? Because that's part of their identity. And you can't just erase that, or you can't, and so regardless of the fact that if everyone is supposed to be equal under the Republic and the government is not saying you need to choose between, being French or being Moroccan, it's just that you're considered French no matter what else you come with. The reality is these individuals who have immigrant backgrounds do feel like they have to choose to a certain extent. And that's not the case necessarily in other countries.
Right. And it's not the case for people who might be culturally of a Christian background, who celebrate Christmas and Easter, and who might, in France, everybody gets married in the state house, in the town hall, but who might also have like a church wedding. They don't feel othered in the same way as someone who might come from an immigrant background, from North Africa, from any other religious background, who feels as though their religious leanings, as essential they might be to their daily life or not, any small leaning you have towards a religion that isn't Christianity in France others you.
Exactly. And I mean, that's just because they're the majority. And so whoever's in the majority, just like, all of the discussions we have now, but in the anti-racism discussion, why do certain things happen and why are there certain privileges? Because white people are the majority and they have been they see themselves as sort of the reference, which, in this case, you could say Christianity is the same. And so, of course, the same considerations aren't made for people of other beliefs. And I think that, as noble as some of these values are, if there are shortcomings or failures, they need to be addressed.
Absolutely. And in terms of these values, I've heard people sort of reduce it down to the idea that in America, the ideal is that we have freedom of religion, while in France, the ideal would be that we have freedom from religion. Does that feel right to you?
Exactly. So that's part of the nuance and why you can't just sort of swap secularism in for laïcité, because it's really also preventing French citizens from feeling like they are in any way being swayed one way or the other by the state. And so there's a level of neutrality that I don't think you necessarily see in America. And neutrality also means that anywhere where you're behaving or navigating the public space, you're not supposed to feel like you're being proselytized to. You're not supposed to feel like you're being pressured in any way to believe one thing or the other. And in the States, I think because everyone is free to show what they believe or how they feel, without sort of any limitation, you might feel, on the contrary, that you're, sort of being pushed one message over the other, if that makes sense. I mean, it's a bit of a subtle nuance, but yeah, free from any pressure of religious belief versus freedom to believe whatever you want. But I don't necessarily think that the American state stays out of it as much either. I mean, I think it's just there's sort of a politically correct through line in America that means that, they're going to, at Christmas, they're going to say Happy Holidays instead of Merry Christmas. And here, they're still very much in France putting the Christian faith as the dominant majority. And so there's really no other, there's no sort of adaptation to messaging around religious beliefs. So you could argue that it would be important for the culture in general to stop assuming that everyone celebrates Christmas, but we're not there yet.
Right. It's not as though in France we're saying happy winter solstice or anything.
No. And again, there's that's a whole separate debate. Should we be so politically correct or not? And we know how the French generally feel about that. But I do think that, you know, the defenders of the right to say Merry Christmas as like a blanket happy holiday tells you that there are going to be people who are isolated by that gesture, and that some people still believe that to be the benchmark, and that's the frame of reference, and everything else is something else. It's the alternative that really isn't as important to acknowledge. I mean, I'm generalizing. I'm being a little bit, simple here, but it does feel like there's got to be some in between, somewhere between America's like self-righteous political correctness and the French obsession with maintaining tradition, even if it offends people in modern times.
Absolutely. Lindsey, thank you so much for joining me to talk about this today. It has been fascinating. I expected nothing less. I have one last question for you before you leave us, and that is, what is your favorite word in French?
Oh, well, I mean, it's nothing as, complicated as laïcité, but I do love the word pamplemousse because I think it's fun to say. That obviously couldn't really merit an entire episode, I don't think. But if I might add something slightly longer than a word, my favorite expression is au bout de la vie, or au bout de sa vie, because it's just so dramatic, and it essentially means, someone who's like had enough and is like at wit's end, and it can be used in so many different contexts, and every single time it makes me laugh.
And that basically literally translates to at the end of his life, right?
Yes. But like someone who has just done an intense workout and looks like they're ready to pass out is au bout de sa vie. But so is someone who is stressed out and exhausted and ready to fall into bed. That person is also au bout de sa vie. So, I mean, it could be used so many different ways. And I just think it's such a dramatic, like over dramatic way of saying someone's had it or is exhausted. And I just love it.
Amazing. Thank you so, so much. Can you tell people where they can find you on the internet, your social medias?
Yes, on all of the media. I am Lost in Cheeseland on Instagram because it's an old name that I've kept on. Also, you can just search for my name on Instagram or Twitter, and you'll come up with me as well. And you can visit my website, lindseytramuta.com. And for specifics about the book, you can visit the new Parisienne with 2 N's.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Emily.
Bye-bye. This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.